A year ago, if someone had told me I'd do something like this, I would have laughed in their faces. Me? The simple, dedicated husband, not a husband prone to his temper getting the better of him? No way. Life turns out to have a twisted sense of humor. It breaks you sometimes in ways you never imagined. My name is David. Happiness for as long as I can remember I thought I knew exactly how it looked. I had a nice life with my wife, Laura, in our little house right outside of Houston, Texas. But I did build that house with my own 2 hands, and every corner of it was packed with memories of us. We did our morning coffee rituals, had many late-night conversations that would end in sleepy laughter, and those perfect simple weekends working in the garden together. To me, that was paradise. I was sure I'd had it all figured out, that I'd done everything right. You never really know what paradise is hiding, but you know something's wrong. I didn't notice how the cracks were forming, or maybe I did and I ignored them. You think that anything will work out if you love someone that much. That was my first mistake. Love makes you blind to reality, and that's your undoing. I remember moving in and Laura was so happy and smiling, and it lit up the whole damn place. This house we promised each other we would grow old in and carry on our dreams together. I was so sure of us. Sure of our future. Sure of her. Perhaps the irony is that certainty lasts just as quickly and you are left doubting everything you once knew. Now I wonder if I should have seen it coming. Were there signs? A difference in her laughter or a different stare in her eyes? Maybe. I ignored the doubts that were pushing me aside, telling myself love could make anything better. That was the second mistake I'd made, and I would certainly be paying for it. Shouldn't it be the noble thing to forgive someone you love? When I found that Laura had been betrayed by first, I tried to remind myself that's what I was saying. A late October night, the now, where the leaves crunch beneath your boots and the air smells of smoke and what's to come. I remember the cold, but it wasn't outside. That is from what I watched on her phone. I wasn't the snooping type. I had trusted them, or so I thought. That night something got me to reach out for her phone while she was in the shower. Perhaps it was because she had been acutely aware of it lately, tucking it face down, keeping it to hand when she didn't need to. I scrolled through her messages, and my hands trembling. I knew, part of me already knew, but I also hoped. There it was. The undeniable evidence. Some guy named Chris text flirts with me. Flirtation? But not just descriptions, plans and promises. I was quite nauseous and thought I was going to throw up right in front of our bed. The woman I loved, the woman that molded my whole life around, had crossed a line I thought she never would. Laura cried when I confronted her. She begged her forgiveness, the stupid mistake, she loved me, only me. I knew her tears were real, I saw the desperation in her eyes. And damn it, I loved her too. I was shattered, furious, but I didn't know how to let go. So, I forgave her. I promised myself that love was worth busting a gut for, we could heal. I wonder looking back if that was the moment I had sealed my own fate. When I forgive her, did I lay myself bare to be broken later? Was I fooling myself, or had I believed in a love that was already over? You'd think after a betrayal like that I would have been more careful, more on guard. The only bad thing about the heart is that it's a stupid thing. But it wants to believe, even if every red flag is waving in your face. So I let myself trust Laura again. I told myself people make mistakes, I told myself love will win anything. But a part of me had suspected the doubt still remained, deep down. It started with small things. Laura started working later and later. She didn't even have to check her phone when she was in the bathroom. She laughed too hard at a couple text messages I wasn't supposed to see. But I asked her about it and she flooded it off with a smile, telling me I'm paranoid. So she'd say to him, David, you must stop worrying. We're good, aren't we? And I'd nod, hating myself for doubting her, even as that voice in the back of my mind whispered, something isn't right. There was a particular night too. There was supposed to be a movie night, something of an alcoholic baseline to help us let our hair down after a long week. Laura, however, would come home looking flustered, with a bit of messier hair than usual, but an odor of an unfamiliar perfume. Not work ran late, she said and looked at her sneakers. My stomach was twisted, but I didn't speak. I gave her a glass of wine and just forced a smile and hoped for the best. That's what my life became, a pretending. I was pretending everything was okay when, in actuality, I was unraveling. Though I can pretend I didn't notice how she put more distance between herself and I can pretend she'd turn away when I extended my hand to try and hold her. I would lay in bed every night, staring at the ceiling, whether I was going crazy or if there was something really sinister going on underneath. Funny the lies we tell ourselves to live without the truth. In my head I told myself I was being insecure, that it was playing tricks on me. Even then, I think I knew. I wasn't ready to accept that fact. We were supposed to just be another regular day. She was giving me a chance to surprise Laura, something which didn't happen often, and I'd gotten home early from work. Perhaps try to rekindle whatever slipped through our fingers, make dinner, light some candles. I thought we could still patch things back together, fix things between us and the life we once lived. Everything there was too quiet when I walked in. The driveway was empty, but other sounds usually heard from Laura's kitchen and in her car were absent, a humming or chatting on the phone. A chill ran up the spine and I ignored it. Relax, I told myself. Stop overthinking everything. I put them on the table and walked over toward our bedroom. Hair as black as coal blew around my face and into my eyes. ### appendices. There was a muffled voice. My heart skipped a beat. Not sure what to make of it, but I hesitated, talking myself out of it, as she was just on a call maybe with a friend or a sister. Sure, but the voice became clearer the closer I got, deep, male, deeply intimate. My body went numb. I grabbed the doorknob, my heart thumping against my chest so loud I thought it would explode out of my chest. I didn't want to see it, didn't want to know what I already knew. Inside me, though, was something other than this, something angry and broken, that pushed me to open that door. And there she was. My wife Laura tangled up in our bedsheets with some guy I'd never seen before. Time seemed to stop. This terrible tableau froze in the room, my world splitting into a million pieces. Eyes wide with horror she gasped and scrambled to cover herself. In front of me was some cocky 20-something punk guy, and he looked at me, dumbfounded. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. My voice was a scream and a sob, and soaking every bit of love and trust one had for her out of me stood there unable to do anything about it. I don't know how long I stood there, I was frozen. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like an eternity. Everything in my world had just simply collapsed right before my front porch, leaving me standing in the pieces and very much at loose ends. It was Laura who broke the silence, first. Her eyes wide with fear, her face pale, she pulled the bedsheet around herself and grabbed it. David. I can explain, her voice was small, pathetic if I had a stomach, and those few shaky words made me feel sick. She could feel the guy she was with embarrassed to look that finally had the decency to feel bad about himself as he scrambled around finding his clothes. But I barely saw him. I focused on Laura. Explain? I thought. Explain what? That you stomped all over my heart, that you tore out? That every time I kissed you, you were lying? That the woman I created my life around wasn't anything but a mirage, a cruel illusion I was too blind to see? I didn't yell. I didn't cry. Like a switch had flipped, something inside me shut down. All the rage, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it was all numbed over by a heavy, suffocating numbness. I turned around and walked out of the room, my mind a blank, my body functioning on automatic. I gripped the counter so hard in the kitchen my knuckles went white. With shallow, ragged gasps I was breathing. I stood there, stared at the clock on the wall, and I wanted to yell at something, to punch the desk, to make the pain stop, but that didn't happen. The sudden thunder of the ticking sound seemed louder than ever, a sad reminder that time didn't give a single fuck about my heartbreak. I was dragged along with it, it kept moving forward. I felt the soft and hesitant footsteps of Laura behind me. Her voice cracked out, "Please, David." But I couldn't face her. Not yet. It was the darkness seeping into my thoughts and nothing else to fear. But I don't think I'd ever felt so many emotions, all at once. All that fell, like a violent wave, on everything I felt, in the dim kitchen, the house I had built with my own hands, where I was suffocating. Rage. Sorrow. Confusion, twisted together. Desperate, Laura's voice behind me was something I hadn't ever heard before. She stepped closer and pleaded, "Hey David, please, just listen to me." But I couldn't turn around. I couldn't look at her face when every muscle in my body was shouting to do something, even something, to give her the pain. Listen? I thought bitterly. How often did I hear it? How many times had I told myself to think she was lying when I knew she was, because I loved her too damn much to assume that? I clenched my jaw so tight I could feel it hurting, and I bit back the words that wanted to come out. Words which would only make this the nightmare it already was. Trying to get some semblance of control, I took a deep breath. I knew it, and control was slipping through my fingers. I replayed the thought of what I'd seen in our bed, in our used bed, over and over again, an endless torture. I closed my eyes to try and remove my memory, to wake up from this hell. Her voice kept cracking, Laura kept talking. She sobbed, "It wasn't anything. It was a mistake, David. Please. I love you." Her words were like gasoline on a fire. Each fire fed the fire already burning hotter in my anger. Almost laughing at the absurdity, I thought love. This was love gone twisted and broke beyond repair. I still wanted to believe her, want to take her hand, go to her and believe that somewhere, deep down, she was there. I turned and some eyes snapped onto me. Tears red, but shedding no sympathy. "I can't." "You love me?" My voice was low and empty, I said. I almost munched into the last pieces of bread, staring at her deeply and then asking, "So do you even know what that means?" She shook her lips, and tried herself to find the words, even if just to make this all go away. She whispered, "David, please, I didn't mean to hurt you," her voice cracking. Standing there wrapped in her bedsheet, mascara smudged from her tears, she was so small, so pitiful. Once I would be shuddering if I saw her cry, and I would want to pull her close, to make it all better. But that time had passed. I needed distance, I needed space to breathe. There was a drumbeat of betrayal pounding in my ears, in my pulse still racing. I was cornered, open to feel the disgust I felt now while cornered between the love I once had. The poison was even better than the bad stuff, warping every good memory we'd shared to a point I couldn't bear. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" Disbelief dripped from word to word. "That doesn't make it better, does it?" My voice was no longer trembling because of fear, my voice was shaking because raw, unfiltered anger was cleansing itself from deep within me. This was when I hadn't yelled at her before, not like this, and I was barely holding it back. Her beads averted nervously towards the fabric of the sheet and she took a step forward. Her voice cracked with emotion and she insisted, "I love you. I did something wrong, but I love you." I just broke that something in me out. That word was ridiculous. I struggled to understand how she could just throw it around as if it could wipe away the picture in my head of her with that other man. It felt like trying to reverse the wreckage of trust, of years of faith in her. The noise of my fist bouncing off of the kitchen counter reverberated through the room. "Stop saying that!" I roared. I was startled by the force of my own voice. Laura shrank like a scolded child, flinching. Then it was just my outburst, the ragged breathing of us both. "I've done what to you? Can you tell me?" My voice cracked as I demanded. Do you even have the slightest clue of what you've ruined? I was barely standing on the razor's edge between fury and despair, and my hands were trembling. There's a strange thing that happens when your world falls apart. You fall into a feeling of being untethered, sort of like you just now beginning to float, and you desperately trying to grab onto something solid. I stood in my own kitchen looking at a woman I didn't know was me. The poison was so deep within me, the pain so twisted in my gut. I still had my love for Laura, but it was twisted and poisoned like it had become something rotten and poisonous to me. Now she was crying, turning her words into incoherent sobs. She choked out, "I'll do anything. Please, David. I can't lose you." She was desperate, raw, and I just couldn't bring myself to care. Pain had marked her, and its ache felt like a poor substitute for the terrible pain that had taken up residence in my soul. By her begging for forgiveness of her not, I couldn't stand it anymore. And so I left the kitchen and started up the stairs to our bedroom. She had betrayed him, and the sheets were still tangled and messy. Seeing them made me sick, like a gut punch. My mind blank until my hands began to shake and I ripped them off the bed and threw them into the corner of the room, as if I could erase what happened. I had 2 moments of comprehension, then my mind was racing and thought was coming too fast. All that anger, and humiliation, and grief, they tugged against each other, trying to drown out the rest of the noise. And then, amidst the chaos, a dark thought whispered, "And make her feel what you feel. Make her hurt." I put my hands to my temples to push back the voice. It was persistent and insidious and promised twisted justice. Maybe it was the only way to precariously tip the scales in order to not feel so powerless. It was horrifying, and yet, it spoke to me. I sat on the edge of the stripped mattress. Where once was love, there was nothing now but a void. Deep inside me, I was crossing a line, something I could not cross back from. The stripped bed was staring right at me, and I don't remember how long I sat there looking at it. Time had lost all meaning. Somewhere around that, I heard Laura's footsteps come in, fumbling like she thought her feet would break through the floor. The doorway had been open and she stood there in the open doorway, her face pale, eyes swollen from crying. She looked down at David, looking up to his face with a very soft "Oh, David," and begged, "Please. Can we just talk?" Her voice barely registered. I felt separate from it, as though I was watching from somewhere far, far away. The anger was still there, but it was hot under the hot surface, waiting for just a tiny thing to light it into a full-blown fire. I was a husk of the man I used to be, but at the moment all I could feel was empty. "So what do you want to tell me, Laura?" Finally, my voice flat, I managed. "What would possibly come out of your mouth that would work to heal this?" Slowly she walked further into the room, gripping the bedsheet up near her own chest. Tears fell from her cheeks where her lips trembled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I love you, David. I still love you." The words cut me, hypocrisy on my face as I laughed bitterly, a way too humorless, harsh sound that didn't even sound like I made it. "Love?" I echoed. "You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means." But it doesn't. Not anymore. Laura dropped down to her knees and wept into her hands. I was twistedly happy to see her that way, broken and beaten. So another part, the part that still remembered our late-night talks, our laughter, our dreams, was being ripped apart all over again. I wanted to hate her. I desired that hatred to consume the last of my love. But it wasn't that simple. I saw them all, a love and hate, pain and longing, and all twisted together until my brain began to hurt. I stood up, doing something other than sit in my own misery. My mind was a storm, but one thought pushed through the chaos, and neither could she have peace if I couldn't. That's when the concept of revenge hardened, an ugly, raw idea comparing those scars she had left in me. Revenge is a dangerous thing. It's a whisper, a passing thought in the back of your mind, but if you let it grow it becomes something. It fester, spread, and slowly you only think about it. That whisper turned to roar as I stood there in our bedroom, encircled by the remains of the life we had forged between us. I knew it wasn't rational. Hurt her just didn't undo what she had done, or heal the pieces of my broken heart. There was no place for that sort of logic anymore. My pain was screaming to be felt, for some weird twisted sense of justice. I slumped down at the foot of our bed and dropped my head into my hands. I tried to think, the wild storm of anger and grief each growing darker than the last of my thoughts. How could I cause her to feel even a minuscule fragment of what she'd forced on me? She couldn't be guilty enough or get her to cry. No, I wanted something more. I wanted to make her suffer and make her understand the absolute breaking of trust. That's when the idea hit me. It was ugly and cruel, and in that moment, I didn't care. And so I thought about all I'd tried to do to be a perfect husband, all of the sacrifices I'd given up to only be repaid with infidelity and lies. Maybe she deserved to learn the true meaning of consequences when she threw our marriage away so easily. I stood up, adrenaline pumping through me, heart pounding with something new. I went to the closet and picked through my toolbox. The weight of what I was planning sunk in as I held my hands around the cold, unforgiving tube of superglue. I truly was going to do this? The part of me that wanted revenge didn't hesitate, though the question hung heavy in the air. It said she deserved this, that it was this that she needed to know what real pain was. It was then that I realized, there was no going back. Whatever happened next was going to change everything from that moment forward, and I'd crossed a line. I clutched that tube of superglue, calm as I felt it, as if I had something to hold onto in the chaos. Just moments before, my hands were trembling with rage, but now they steadied. There was a sense of grim determination settling over me, an icy clarity that whispered, "This will make things right." Downstairs I stepped back out of the bedroom. With his head in his hands, shoulders shaking, silent sobbing, Laura was sitting at the kitchen table. She looked like that, and I would have broken if I saw her like that once. I would have dropped everything and ran to comfort her. By now, all I had was a holy sense of detachment, and it felt like that part of me that had loved her has been carved out, far into rot. At the sound of me coming in, she looked up, and her eyes were red and swollen. "David," she started, but I didn't let her. I didn't even look at her before walking past her, straight past her. It was confusing, fearful, as I fumbled through a drawer pretending to look for something trivial. I was planning, calculating, racing my mind. What do I want her to feel? The question gnawed at me. I wanted her to feel trapped, helpless, and I did, too, when I learned that she was a traitor. I needed her to know that there were consequences to some actions, that her betrayal had broken something inside and that could never heal. The sound of her voice was barely more than a whisper, and she tried one more time, "David, please." There was exhaustion in her voice, like she was nearly giving up on excuses and excuses. I ignored her, my mind fixated upon what I'd about to do. Fingers still wrapped tightly around a superglue, I closed the drawer. I turned to face her, letting her know how bad it got to her. How bad the darkness in my eyes was, how much raw hurt and anger I've been trying to keep at bay. She saw something had shifted in me, something that wasn't going to turn back around. "You think this is over?" My voice low and dangerous, I said. "You just write a nice apology and it goes away?" Her silence answered enough, and I knew then it was too late for me. Something in me almost faltered. I don't know, it was how her face crumbled or how her body gave up hopefulness. I did feel a pang of guilt for a moment. Yet more wounding than that, the pain of betrayal twisted hard like a knife in my chest and drowned any sympathy I might have felt. I assume Laura had seen my expression shift, because she straightened slightly, eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. Like it could keep her safe, she clutched the bedsheet tighter around her. "David," she whispered out. "We can fix this, we can." Fix this? Her words fueled a spark of anger that caught and melted hot and fast. She couldn't believe that there was anything left to salvage. Like it took a heartfelt apology to piece the shattered pieces of my trust back together enough to erase the image of her in our bed with another man. She flinched and back-pressed against the wall and took a step closer. I should have felt pity, remorse, or at least felt like forgiving her, at the very least, her fear. What it did was make me feel a sick satisfaction. She deserved to be scared. I deserved to be the thorn in her side, even a fraction of what she had infused onto me. You want to fix this? Almost a growl, I said. How are you going to make me not see him, when every time I look at you I see him? She asked. I saw her shrinking into herself, gasping in shallow breaths. Good. I was going to let her feel the stifling burden of sorrow just as I had. Even as I spat those words I could feel something dark, something dangerous unfurling within me. A part of it wasn't just about understanding her. I had plenty of control to lose, sweeping all my humanity with it, and it was about taking back what I'd lost, even if it meant doing something that would stain away forever what little humanity I had left. I squeezed the tube of superglue. He had no choice, there was no turning back. I had stepped across, and that was all that was left ahead, reckoning. 1 minute you'll be raging, still working at all, but your rage swallows you so completely it feels like a force of nature, something you can't stop even if you wanted to. I was over there, on the edge of no coming back. I was so tight around that tube of superglue I could feel my knuckles white, and all I could feel was fire in my chest with each breath. Frozen, eyes wide, locked on mine, Laura was still against the wall. It was terrifying, but she didn't run. Maybe she was hoping to stay still long enough to dodge the storm about to hit. However, there was no way past this, no way to calm the storm I had become. My voice was dangerously calm, my footsteps closed. I ordered, "Take off the sheet." Clutching the fabric closer to her, she flinched. She begged, tears filling her face, David, please." There was no room for mercy anymore in me. "Take it off." The words were each cold, deliberate, and with no room for argument. Looking at me, she seemed not to recognize me anymore. Laura hesitated. Maybe she didn't. Could it be that maybe this man she knew, this man who loved her and would do anything to protect her, was gone, replaced with this broken shell? She gave up on the sheet, letting it drop slowly. She washed in shame and vulnerability and tried to cover herself with her hands. There was a momentary coming of satisfaction, of power, twisted. But it wasn't enough. There'd be nothing to make that betrayal go away that would ever be enough. Her eyes widened in realization, and I lifted the tube of superglue. She screamed, "David, no," and I grabbed her wrist hard. My voice was raw and trembling, but I hissed, "You don't get to hurt me and walk away. You need to feel it, too." The room filled with her sobs, a symphony of desperation and fear. My hands were steady even in the chaos that was my head as I unscrewed the cap of the glue. I was judge, jury and executioner, and the man I used to be a faded reflection behind me. I held the tube of superglue and time felt to be moving in slow motion. As if I was underwater, every sound was muffled. They blurred, and the things I had heard and seen, Laura's sobs, the floorboards creaking as she tried to pull away, the dull roar of blood in my ears, they all became the background. Even if he was lying, the crushing weight of betrayal and the cruel satisfaction I finally was doing something to even the score, that meant something. A flicker of hesitation passed through my mind as I tightened my grip on her wrist to punish the one who'd inflicted pain on me, and leaned in, readying myself to make her feel the very same pain. A tiny voice, barely audible, whispered, "Is this who you want to be?" I ignored it. I had to. If I listened to that voice, I'd fall apart, but I couldn't give it anything. Not after all she'd just done. At the time, the image of her with another man in our bed burned itself into my mind, an ugly, unforgiving image. The anger faded as the glue grew closer and the voice grew louder, cutting out the haze from my anger. It asked, clearer now, with a blend of guilt, reason echoing in dissonance. "What are you doing? This isn't justice. This isn't who you are." The two halves of me argued with each other under my hand, and the superglue started to waver, and then my hand started to tremble. One part wanted to complete what I started, to make her suffer, to show I couldn't be pushed around. The other part, however, the part that still did hold on to the man I used to be, fought desperately to stop me. Laura's eyes locked onto mine, wide and terrified, and I could see it, the real, raw fear. I couldn't hear her anymore because her lips were moving. All I could see was how she shook, stood up for whatever unimaginable torture I would now commit. I don't know what finally pierced the wall of anger, but it did. So much for the glue tube, and my hand slipped and the tube cluttered, sounding sharp and jarring on the floor. I let go of her wrist and my knees buckled, and I staggered backward. The wave of shame and of self-loathing was too much, the reality of what I'd almost done slamming into me headfirst, suffocating me. I clapped my hands to my mouth, stumbling away, collapsing against the wall, gasping for breath. What the hell had I become? Slumped against the wall I sat, a weight bearing down on me by the hand of my own actions. It all felt too real that I'd been so close to crossing an unforgivable line. I was breathing out ragged, shallow bursts, and I felt genuine terror for the first time ever, not of losing Laura, or losing my Laura, but of myself. What had I almost become? Laura too had crumpled on the floor to her, shaking with grief. Her arms were around herself, making herself as small as possible because she knew that if she could just not exist in this nightmare, she would be okay. It was instinct, and it was a reaction to the anger that had gripped me but moments ago, and it was a replacement for that anger, and it was a wave of guilt so strong that I could bring myself to tears. My mind flew 1,000 thoughts, none of them adding up or making any sense. I wanted to yell at the universe, at how unfair this was all, and how it had torn everything from me once again. How had we gotten here? Yet how had the love that filled the center of my world become all of this toxic mess of rage, fear and betrayal? Laura's sobs carried on in the room, and I had to force myself to look at her. What I saw was not the optimistic, sassy woman I'd fallen in love with. I had shattered her, she was broken and afraid, and I realized I had done that to her. I was the monster now, no matter what she had done to me. The words my throat scraped out of me, raw and not worth two figures. They felt worthless, useless in the wake of what had been done. God, I'm so sorry. What did apologies mean now? If they haven't even touched the wreckage we had left in each other. She flinched at my words, even that was too much for her. Slowly she looked up, eyes bloodshot and swollen, a mask of pain and disbelief. I kept wondering if she could ever forgive me, or if I ever could. The silence and the room were suffocating. The emptiness I had in place of all the rage that had made me hype, all the hype. I hovered through the ruins of a life I couldn't recognize, as a man in a hollow. We were silent for several uncomfortably endless moments. My own breathing was slowing, and in slow, stilted sobs gone quiet, exhausted they had become, Laura's had faded. We were two broken people, this debris of what had been a breakup and made something unbreakable. What I tried to say, what I tried to make, happened the words would not. What was there to say? It didn't matter whether I apologized or explained, I felt apologies felt useless and explanations pointless. There was nothing we could do to repair the damage we'd done, the killing we'd done to each other, the damage we'd perpetrated to our very souls. Laura's knees pulled up to her chest, curling up, as if to protect what she had left of her heart. It was a dull voice, and one that barely whispered. The trembling words made her ask, what happened to us? It felt like something drifted in the air, something that mimicked everything we lost. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how to explain how something that was once unbreakable was unraveling. I now thought back to when we met the first time, the spark, how we didn't touch, how we dreamed the future together that felt like such a cruel joke now. What happened from that, to this? Finally I said, I don't know. My voice thick with emotion. That was the honest thing I could give her, the truth. I don't remember when the cracks first formed, when the chasm between us was only moving farther and farther apart. Or maybe it had been there all along and slowly been growing all while we looked the other way. Her hands shook and she wiped at her face. She whispered, I loved you, and past tense softened the blow. She said it like a goodbye, and it hit me harder than I thought it would. I knew she was right. That former love we had, that real love, was gone. Once it had been eaten alive by lies and pain, the only thing left was a shadow of what was once. But I blinked away my own tears at the edges of my eyes. There was no time to break down now. I murmured, "Yeah," the word almost stuck in my throat. "I loved you too." And there it was. The finality of it. We had lost something we could never get back, we had each admitted. After that it all blurred into hours. And we'd drift around the house like ghosts, not speaking to each other, circling the same complicated thoughts. There was an oppressive silence and an oppressive tension, the kind that hangs on even when the silence is deafening. We were waiting for something to break, so that one of us could break under the pressure. Myself, I am standing in the kitchen sink, looking out the window of the kitchen, looking at the backyard. It had once been a garden we tended together, but now it was a wild, tangled, overgrown plot, a depressing example of what we had become. Dirtying our hands in the soil, planting flowers and pulling weeds was how we used to laugh. It was now another life, a cruel memory taunting me. Until she spoke, I didn't hear her come up behind me. "David, what do we do now?" She was no longer angry, there was no fight in her. It was just a tired, worn-out resignation, and my heart ached just as much. I grabbed the edge of the sink in an effort to steady myself. "I didn't have an answer," I said, but the question stopped me harder than I expected. It was like the rage that drove me, and the hatred that ate me, that left me feeling empty and lost, in a place I'd never known. What did we do now? Well, I didn't know. I just whispered, "I don't know." They tastes bitter, laden with the wreckage of everything we had destroyed. I wheeled around to face her, and looked at her, really, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. But there was something about her that made her older, and her face was marked lines of grief and regret. The tears started to well up in her eyes. "We can't stay like this," she told me. "We're just going to keep hurting each other." I knew he was right and couldn't fathom moving forward. I wanted to go back in time, to before it all went to hell, and find just the right moment and fix it. But time only has one way, and we were too broken to pretend we would ever return. "Maybe," I started, my voice cracking. "Maybe we're past saving." It was a death sentence, but it also felt true. Some things can't be fixed. Some wounds never heal. Her lips uttered a sob and her shoulders slumped. It was a sound of finality, of something ending, and I felt it in my bones. Our love was gone now and replaced with this endless ache in our chests and the knowledge that we'd done irreparable damage. The house that was once warm, familiar, now felt foreign, cold, alien, not ours. We had been, and it was slipping away, and every piece of furniture, every photo frame, every corner was an echo of what we had been. Two strangers in remains after a love had shattered. Elora and I stood there. There was silence between us, a sick reminder that the words we had spoken could not heal the damage done. I didn't know how to say goodbye to something that meant as much to me as it did. Even if we weren't working anymore, the idea of letting go felt like I were losing part of me I would never get back. Her fingers trembled, wiping her eyes. Her voice was fragile, as she didn't think we'd ever be okay. Only her gaze sought out my own, looking for hope, a sign, something to grasp onto in the wet storm around us. The lump in my throat almost choked me. I swallowed hard. "I don't know," I admitted. That was the only honest thing I could give her. There were too many broken pieces to repair, that way too many things said and done, unsayable. I was the person I'd become, and it scared me, and I knew she was haunted by all that we'd each become. She breathed, her shoulders sagging under it all. She started a maybe, but her voice trailed off. "That may be something we need to think about, figuring out who we are with each other." The words lay there in the air, and I knew she was right. It hurt, but it was true. She was terrifying even now, and the thought of being without her terrified me. It was something that caused you to cling to a burning house, to save something that already was ash and ruin. We had loved too much, or else we would have cut each other much less deeply. It was final and slight, a nod. My voice broke, and I said, "Maybe we do." The reality of it settled between us, our farewell, not in anger or accusation, but with an acceptance of the understanding that our love was spent. Her hand reached for my hand, touching as she began to hesitate before her finger was able to brush mine. For one last moment, we held on to each other, the only sign of having been and of having lost. She let go then, allowing me to feel the dead place she left behind. The most painful goodbye is when you know that love isn't enough sometimes. Those days that followed seemed like some sort of surreal dream I couldn't escape. The house was too quiet for the once familiar rhythms to which it was accustomed. She decided to offer us both space to heal and think, to figure out what came next, so Laura and I had agreed that she would move out for a while. I saw her put things in her bag. Each one she puts out seems to take a piece of our life away. Haunted by memories, I wandered through empty rooms for most of my time. The couch where we curled up to watch movies, the kitchen where we'd dance, laughing, while we cooked dinner. It was everything painful echo reminder what had been and what was now lost. Concerned friends called, and when they did, I remained silent. I had no idea what to say to explain what had happened, no idea how to say that it was quite so bad that I had to keep it to myself. In my chest was shame and regret, heavy. Tell me, how do you explain that the love you made a world around had changed to something you didn't even know anymore? I remember one night, sitting in the garden and staring at dead weeds and dead flowers. It was pretty obvious how we'd both let things slip. We didn't neglect, this was neglect. I gripped a pair of gloves, and started pulling weeds, dirt coating my fingernails. Ripping out the decay, trying to bring some order back into the chaos almost felt therapeutic. Despite how hard I'd tried, I couldn't shake this overwhelming emptiness. I'd found myself not only missing Laura, but I'd lost a part of myself, and I had no idea how to get it back. He, the man with his plans and his dreams, the man who had loved and believed, was a ghost, a shadow of who I had become. I sat back, exhausted, and wondered if this was the beginning of something new or the end of something, or the long, slow unraveling of everything. The ideas of healing were impossible, for stronger people. My staring at the cleared patch of soil was interrupted by the wondering whether, perhaps, I could do something new and begin to plant something new. It was a blur of small steps followed by quiet realizations of what was to come. The house without Laura was even emptier. Laura had officially moved out. I had days when I was numb, a gut punch from one end of the day and another at the tail end, or I would just be operating on autopilot, but I had other days where it weighed a little lighter, where it wasn't suffocating so much. I learned that healing wasn't a straight path. The whole thing was full of setbacks, people popping out of nowhere, and moments of clarity I had no idea would still be there. One evening, there I sat at the dining table, with a stack of unopened mail in front of me. Insurance papers, bills, letters from friends I hadn't called and hadn't replied to. Even when everything inside you had stopped, life marched forward. I had picked up a letter from an old college friend who had heard about the split and just wanted to check in. I read his words, carefully, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't need to shut myself off in the world. It may be time to start allowing life in, even if it hurts. My eyes wandered over to the bare patch of soil in the garden. I took a deep breath and put the letter down. I'd cleared it, prepared it, but I hadn't planted anything yet. That simple action had led to an odd comfort, some control in a world that made me feel chaotic and unforgiving. It was intimidating, but what made sense was planting something new. I was startled out of my thoughts by the doorbell ringing. Turning it, I saw our neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, smiley and holding a plate of cookies. She had always been a good soul, the type that never passed up an opportunity to bring baked goods to someone suffering. "Didn't you think you might like these?" she said gently, her eyes a grandmotherly concern. Graciously taking the plate, I thanked her, and it hit me more than I expected. Despite all the pain and betrayal, It reminded me of good things to come, good moments. When I closed the door, I felt something stirred inside me. Deceptively fragile, fragile like the first of spring green shoots, but out of the earth, spring had sprouted up. Hope. It was nothing, really, but it was something. I didn't know what was waiting for me. I didn't know whether I'd ever be whole again, or if the scars that Laura and I put on each other would ever get better. It was enough to start over, but as I stood, holding a plate of cookies and fridge space provided by a well-meaning neighbor, I realized that perhaps, just perhaps, it would suffice. Things like one small step, one day at a time. What if I just planted a seed and waited to see what might grow?